In this stories and lessons from the field, we're going to focus on domestic violence. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the parties and the families behind the case of Nicholson v. Williams. Now, in order to keep the video a little shorter, I'm going to link the entirety of the case at the end of the video. I highly recommend that you watch it. It's an important case to know, and their stories are compelling, and their bravery to fight not just for themselves and their children, but to change policy so that future generations of victims and families would not go through what they went through is amazing. Now, imagine it's 1999 and you're a single mother in New York City and you have two beautiful children, a son and a daughter. And you are working full time, you're going to school full time, all to make sure your children have a good life. Imagine overnight you find yourself the victim of domestic violence and you are threatened with your children being removed from you. And this is Miss Charlene Nicholson's story. This is also the story of April Rodriguez and the story of Ekeate Udo. And I'm going to focus on Miss Nicholson's story, but again, I'm going to link the case, and I recommend that you read Miss Rodriguez and Miss Udo's story because they all tell the story of a policy gone wrong. This case, Nicholson v. Williams specifically, is still cited nationwide. It still informs policy related to domestic violence. So whether you're a party or a practitioner, it is a case to know. It's a case where you can understand the cycles of domestic violence, the impact that legislation and rules have on families, and how children are affected. I have still, in recent years, seen what I would call almost victim shaming because there is a lack of understanding of the psychological effects and cycles of domestic violence, and that's why I tell these stories. Prior to 2000, in New York City and probably in other jurisdictions in the country, victims of domestic violence were charged in dependency and neglect cases, and they were alleged to be neglectful of their children for failing to or their inability to protect their children from domestic violence, and oftentimes their children would be taken away from them. Now, sitting here in 2024, if you take a pause and think about that, it sounds pretty awful. And it was a form of re-traumatization for victims and their children. Essentially, it said that the victims were engaged in domestic violence by being abused. And again, if you just take a pause and think about that. Children exposed to domestic violence very often are almost trauma bonded to the parent who's being abused. They worry for that parent, they worry for that parent's safety. And one of the worst things you can do is then take that child away from that parent after a traumatic event, whether or not the child witnessed that. And Dr. David Pelkovics even said it's the equivalent of rubbing salt into that child's wounds. And the one thing that was forgotten at that time, and I think still is not always considered, is when you take that child away from that parent and put them in non-kinship foster care, particularly with strangers, essentially, there's a risk of that child being abused more than what they might have been put into care for. So these were factors that at that time were not considered, and it was just kind of a go-to. So back to Miss Nicholson's case, she was having a visit with the father of her daughter, and her son was at school. And now the father of her daughter, his name was Mr. Barnett, lived in South Carolina, and he would visit with his daughter about once a month and come up and see Miss Nicholson. Now on this date, on or about January 27th of 1999, when he came up to visit, Miss Nicholson told him that she did not want to pursue a relationship with him anymore. He became so enraged that he viciously attacked her. He punched her, he kicked her, and he threw objects at her. When he left, she was bleeding profusely. The only saving grace was that her son was at school and her daughter was sleeping in her crib and did not witness the attack on their mother. Miss Nicholson called 911 right away and asked to be transported to the hospital. And despite bleeding, despite obviously being in pain, she still had the wherewithal to go to a neighbor and ensure that her son would be picked up from the bus stop and that the neighbor would take care of her daughter and watch her children. On that same evening, while she's in the hospital, where they discover she has a broken arm, she has fractured ribs, she has head injuries as a result of this attack, The police come and interview her. Children's Services then goes to her home and takes her children away from her neighbors. Now, obviously, this is incredibly horrifying to Miss Nicholson. She's already been through trauma, and then she's being told her children are being taken away. The caseworker that was assigned to the case, caseworker Williams, testified in court that he believed that the children were in imminent risk if they remained in Miss Nicholson's care because at the time of the attack, she was not able to protect herself or her children. There was no history of extensive DV between Miss Nicholson and Mr. Barnett, but he found that she was not able to protect her children while she was being beaten. And again, if you just pause and kind of think about that. I cannot imagine the panic that she must have felt at that moment on top of her injuries. Despite that, she offered relatives where her children could stay and be safe. And again, these are kids who haven't seen their mom. Her son left in the morning saying bye to his mom, came home from school to a neighbor and then a caseworker and being taken away. I cannot imagine the trauma to them. She was not allowed to see her children, who, by the way, were not placed with a relative, despite her offering names, were instead placed in non-kinship foster care, or essentially with strangers. For 8 days, she did not see her children after the incident. And when she finally saw them, it was at a supervised setting at Children's Services. And it was there she discovered that her children were being abused in foster care, and they reported that they were being hit. At that visit, she called the police to make a report because she could see visible injuries on her children. Despite all this, it was not until 21 days later that her children were finally returned to her. And I cannot imagine the trauma to both Miss Nicholson and her children. Rather than holding the abuser accountable, these policies were essentially punishing the victim and the children. Miss Nicholson, along with Miss Rodriguez and Miss Udo, did not give up. They took their case to the New York Court of Appeals and claimed that they were deprived their 14th Amendment rights, that they were deprived procedural and substantive due process, particularly given that these issues involve familial and parental relationships. Their rights. And on October 26th of 2024, the New York Court of Appeals unanimously held that a mother's inability to protect a child from witnessing abuse does not constitute neglect. And it can't be the only basis for removal. There has to be other things to be found neglectful. And the court also held that any decision to remove a child, it has to be weighed against the psychological harm to that child that could be created by removing them. Is removing them worse than letting them stay in that environment? Are there services that can be put in place to help the victims and the children before we just remove them? And the court also held that only in the rarest of instances, we're talking true emergencies, can this decision or should this decision be made without getting judicial approval, which means you have to go to court. You have to respect a party's and a parent's due process rights and their right to parent their child. This case was incredibly significant. I remember as a city attorney working shortly after this case came out and reading it, I was shocked that this had been the policy prior to me joining and that victims of domestic violence were being charged with neglect. I'm incredibly happy that policies not only in New York City but around the nation started changing, and in fact Nicholson v. Williams is still regularly cited in domestic violence work, domestic violence literature, because it was significant. And I think this story should be told, the stories of these very brave and strong women who changed policies for countless other victims of domestic violence who might have gone through the same thing after them and who had gone through it before. I hope this video was helpful and I hope you learned something. I hope you join us on our next Lessons Learned video, and please check out the case law that's going to be linked at the end of this video. And if you are a victim of domestic violence, please always feel free to reach out to our firm. We're happy to direct you to resources and help you in any way that we can.